We are rolling. Okay, hello. Welcome to the first of the case.science podcasts. Case.science is an AI platform. It allows you to explore data-led statements, and an AI helps you read through a number of sources attached to that statement. And on this podcast, we're going to have guests on who have a particular case to make, and we're going to explore that case on the podcast. And then for you guys listening, you could go to case.science, find that case and check out all of the sources inside it, ask any question that you want of that data. So for the first case.science podcast, I couldn't be happier to have Clare Craig. She's a consultant pathologist and now an author of a new book, Expired. It's available on Amazon right now. She has a new book on the way. And since 2020, Clare has carried out research into COVID and COVID policy independently as the co-chair of HEART, and she's been very active on Twitter and elsewhere, highlighting big problems with data collection, amongst many, many other things, which I'm sure we will get into. Clare, hello.
Hello, Phil. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, of course. I couldn't be happy with the first guest, and we have a lot to discuss.
Absolutely, and I'll tell you, I'm really excited about what CASE can do as well. So I'm very excited to be the first guest.
I built it because there's a big gap between even what I believe the regulators are paying attention to, certainly what the media are paying attention to, and what independent researchers and scientists are interested in. And it seems to me we have a sort of twin reality tunnel that we're all inside of. One in which, if you don't look much further than what you hear in official advice, guidance circles, the media and elsewhere, you'll learn X. And if you dig a little deeper and perhaps are comfortable with venturing into some taboo areas, perhaps, you'll find a whole range of data that might surprise you. And what case.science is trying to do is to bring that data to the forefront in a really easy to access way, something where you could collect all of that data that might surprise people, put it in a single place and share it and say, look, here is lots of information that you probably haven't seen, because more and more it's difficult to find that information via Google.
Yeah, although to be fair, I mean, there's an awful lot of information that's peer reviewed, that's in the literature that people also haven't seen. And so, I think it's, you can build these cases based on just sort of independent researchers whose research just hasn't really seen much light yet.
Why don't we kickstart off with the adversarial subject of your case?
The way you asked me to pitch this was to say, when you're forming a case, you're not asking the question. So my question would be, what's happening? Why are we having too many people having heart attacks at the moment? What is the cause of that? Because it's got this adversarial element, we're doing it as if, this house believes that. So my case is, this house believes that the COVID vaccines are the cause of this rise in heart attack.
If you're hearing this subject for the first time and you hear this statement, I know how that makes people feel. It's often, there's an immune response to it, like this can't possibly be true. But hold on, stick with us, and hopefully by the end of this podcast, if the case has been made well, at least some curiosity will be there. Anything you disagree with, we're welcome to hear that in another case, in another time, in another podcast, in another way. But stick with us and let's see if we can get through some of the data that supports this case. So why don't we kickstart with this issue of myocarditis, which I think is relatively well known. And it wasn't something that was acknowledged at the start of this whole saga. And broadly, it is now acknowledged.
So actually, if you look back, there was a lot of evidence from very early on, because when they first rolled out the vaccines, it was aimed at the most old and frail, but it was also given to healthcare workers and social care workers. So there were a lot of young people being vaccinated from the beginning. And with myocarditis and pericarditis, the problem is much worse the younger you are, and also in men and boys. And yet the evidence as it was emerging was being hidden. So there's all sorts of stuff we now know was being shared between the regulators and that they weren't sharing with the public and that they were denying in public for many months. until the sort of pressure became too much, and one by one the regulators admitted that it was a problem. And then, of course, the next issue becomes measuring that problem. And so, when they admit it's a problem, it's very, very rare. And as time goes on, and what do you know, it wasn't quite as rare as we thought it was. And so that's always the issue with drug safety, actually. Whenever you've got a problem with drug safety, there's always the problem of getting the measurement right. And very often the initial concerns are a massive underestimate about the size of the problem. And that's what we saw here, was that they were underestimating it. And over time, it's become obvious that it was not as rare, but it's still fairly rare, right? Mm-hmm. It's still fairly rare. But my concern is that it represents a bit of a tip of an iceberg. So the patients who ended up in hospital with that diagnosis on their record are extreme cases where other people might have had more subtle changes in their heart.
So there's a lot in there, a lot of different places we can go. But I'm going to try and play the role of a person who's skeptical here. How can we even begin to measure this? What signals and signs do we have that there is a problem?
Okay, so the very first thing you do when you're trying to measure the drug safety is just look at reports doctors are making saying, I've got a concern here. Now, what's interesting about myocarditis is that it's normally very, very rare. So when somebody has it in temporal association with their vaccine, it's really easy for a doctor to say this is a problem, because they wouldn't readily think that someone would otherwise be having myocarditis because it's so rare. So often what you find is that the evidence for rare conditions is much, much stronger than when a problem is, adding to something that's already quite common. So you have those reports. The next thing you want to do is try to measure it. And we have plenty of studies now where people have looked at hospital records. You take a group of hospitals and you just see how many patients are coming in and getting that diagnosis over time. So you look at the hospital records and you measure how many people are coming in with that diagnosis over time. And the regulators collect that kind of evidence to try to get a handle on how common something is. But what you also do, the academics are doing it too, and academics have published. And one really important piece of data that has been replicated across countries and across regions is that when you look at the level of myocarditis in 2020, it didn't move from previous levels. Now, that doesn't mean that COVID never caused it. What it means is that viruses that used to cause it at the same rate as COVID caused it. COVID didn't change anything. People used to get viral myocarditis, they got viral myocarditis at the same rate. Then the vaccines get rolled out, and then there's this massive surge in diagnoses of myocarditis. Now, some of them might have been after COVID, but they're after COVID in vaccinated people, not in unvaccinated people.
So which source will people look for? I believe you've probably put something in your case about that. I know that Jack and Napes on Substack writes about that. You guys write about it on Heart. So if people are interested to look at that data, I suggest they go to your case, type in myocarditis 2020 or something like that.
So actually, if you type in myocarditis vaccine rollout, you'll find
vaccine
it.
rollout. Okay, so the next thing to get into, well, there's another thing beforehand actually. Myocarditis. Let's explain what that actually is, because I think it's important. People hear the phrase, and obviously there's a cause there, and again, that's a wormhole we probably don't want to get sucked too deep into. But what actually is myocarditis?
Right. So, like all the itises in medicine, that means inflammation, and it's inflammation of the muscle of the heart. So, like the heart muscle has got inflammatory cells that are on the attack, and that's a really terrible scenario, because you're born with your heart cells and they don't get replaced. So when you've had a heart cell that's been damaged, you can end up with scarring in that area of the heart, which can be, even when it's tiny, can be a massive problem if it's in the wrong part of the heart, because your heart has got this delicate electrical conduction system that's allowing it to be in rhythm.
So that the heart cells, when they die from some, effect like myocarditis or whatever it is that's caused this swelling of the heart, they actually don't replace themselves much like the rest of the body might do. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
So there was this thing that happened in the United States, less so in the United Kingdom. So if anyone's listening wants to fill us in on elsewhere if this happened, but I do know this happened in the United States. There was a discussion, once this myocarditis signal was acknowledged, then there was this effort to downplay that signal. I believe that Tony Fauci himself was saying that it's mild and self-resolving.
In a very, very rare case, some of the mRNA vaccines can cause a self-limiting, almost invariably benign inflammatory response in the heart, which generally resolves in a very short period of time. It is very, very rare.
There was some discussion around that, and I heard that repeated quite a lot. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost, they've said it so many times that if you hear the word myocarditis, you almost start to think mild now, because it's being said in the press so often in a sequence. And what I think they are referencing is that a lot of these people who've had a post-vaccine diagnosis of myocarditis and been in hospital have since left hospital, right? You know, they're not dying in hospital in that first admission. Right, then they're not. It's mild in that sense. But if you're damaging your heart muscle, you know, it's a bit like damaging your brain muscle. You don't have mild brain damage. Brain damage is brain damage, and heart damage is heart damage. And we don't yet know what the long-term outcome is going to be, but we do have ways of predicting what it might be. And one way is to look at what happens when people had viral myocarditis. So, you know, it's much the same pathology in terms of an immune response that's causing inflammation in the heart. And the outcome for people with viral myocarditis is really awful. It's really, really awful. It's a sort of 20% mortality in 5 years type situation. And then even if you manage to avoid that outcome, you've also got this long-term problem of, if you've got scarring in the heart, has that increased your chances of an electrical arrhythmia later in life that could shorten your life expectancy? And it's going to be a difficult thing to measure, and obviously actually you can only do it in due course, but hypothetically it's absolutely something we need to measure.
So I think that there's an interesting way to conceptualize this, that in this instance a problem emerged that wasn't acknowledged at the start, and now because there's so much data that supported it, which you can find on case.science, and in fact I would point you to another case. It's not Clare's, it's actually with a guy who probably will come on this podcast, and there's 3,665 case studies that have been collected about side effects associated with the mRNA and viral vector vaccines. If you type myocarditis into that one, you'll see that there are many, many, many of these case studies that were published in the scientific literature, and I saw that some of them were published as early as February 2021. Yeah, very, very, very soon. Some of them came out of Israel, and there were a couple in Italy. So you can go ahead and check out those case studies for yourself, because what I think that helps you understand is that this isn't just some conversation of misinformation and people making stuff up, which is very often conceptualized that way. There is real data in the scientific literature backing these positions up, and it was there for a long time before this problem was acknowledged. Then what happens is the problem is acknowledged, and you see this very clear effort to downplay that problem, and you even see this now. So, do the public know what myocarditis is? Almost certainly not. You'd have to go and speak with a cardiologist about what that really means. But you heard again and again and again that this issue that they were forced to acknowledge was actually milder than perhaps it is. Let's put it that way.
There's been several reports which are included in both of those cases, I should think, of postmortems after myocarditis. People have died from it, and the first two deaths to be acknowledged again were in Israel and were that early on. This was happening from the beginning. People were dying of myocarditis who were not at risk of COVID. And what we've seen repeatedly is this claim that COVID causes myocarditis, and therefore, because it causes more myocarditis, that means it's all right and the balance is worth it. And this is wrong on so many levels. So the first level is how they've measured COVID causing myocarditis. So if you remember, if you look at the big picture story, there was no increase in myocarditis. But if you want to say COVID causes it, all you have to do is you take a hospitalized population of people with COVID, and you say, well, myocarditis is actually quite hard to diagnose. There's a variety of different, if you have a post-mortem, yeah, great, you can diagnose it. If you have a biopsy of a heart, you can diagnose it, but you don't want to start, taking nibbles of people's hearts when they're alive. So then you're onto sort of diagnostic tests, which are not as black and white, and that build up a picture along with what the doctor knows about the patient. And together that picture gives you a score that gives you confidence about how much likely it is to be myocarditis. And one of the things that contributes to that score is this enzyme that gets released by damaged heart cells called troponin, which is also a test just for irregular heart attacks. If you've got damaged heart cells, the cells will release this into your blood and you can measure it as a blood test. And so if you take a population of people in hospital with COVID, including the ITU population, and you say, well, let's just measure their troponin level to see if any of them had the rise in that. Well, yeah, they did, because people on intensive care have got all sorts of organ failures. That's why they're there. So yeah, they'll have a rise in troponin. That's not myocarditis. That's like heart failure problems from, total body failure. And so calling that myocarditis is really disingenuous. And then the additional problem you've got is that the claim that COVID causes myocarditis, therefore a bit of myocarditis with your vaccine's okay, is nonsense. And it's based entirely on this wrong belief that the vaccine would stop you getting COVID. Now, we all know that that was nonsense. And almost everyone who's been vaccinated has since had COVID, and if they haven't yet, they probably will. And so you're actually having both of the risks. You've got the risk from the vaccine, and then if there is a risk with the virus, you've got that too. And when I was explaining earlier about how higher the incidence of myocarditis is since the vaccine, probably your risk after the virus is worse than it was.
There is another study that I think may or may not be in your case that speaks to this, that came out of Israel, because I hear this quite often, which is viral myocarditis is worse. But there was, as you say, one of the problems with that is even if you get the vaccine, it won't stop you getting coronavirus anyway. So now you have the risk of this viral myocarditis, which you're exposed to anyway, and you have this additional risk associated with the vaccine. So it's kind of a loss on that front. But even to speak to that point, there's a study that came out of Israel that did a big comparison. I can't remember what the N size was. It is inside your case. Or if it's not, we should put it there. And it showed broadly that there wasn't a huge difference in people.
There was no link between COVID and myocarditis across Israel in 2020. Like they went and hunted for it, and there was no association. Like when you diagnose it correctly, it's not there.
So that's on the issue of like risk reduction, which again I don't think was particularly well understood. You heard this thing about 99% effective here in the UK. On the AZ we heard 100% effective. There's the famous meme now that's gone around about how that efficacy dropped several times all the way down to absurdly low numbers. But that efficacy number is associated with risk reward, which is not really well understood. And that gets us onto this idea of, well, how common is this? And there's a range of numbers that people use, but this is the spookier aspect of this. What data do we think we have about how realistic these risks are?
So what you'll find is that when people are trying to downplay it, they will look at a bigger group. So they'll look at men and women together, they'll look at broader age ranges. But when you focus it on 16 to 19-year-old boys, men, then it's 1 in 6,000. And it's been replicated, that's replicable. And this was known before the vaccines were approved for that age group in this country. And the JCVI discussed this problem. They knew it was a problem, and they were put under pressure and they approved them anyway. And it was, these people, the people who are under 19 do not have a risk from COVID. It's just that they were not doing it in their best interests at all. You can't make that argument. Again, this is the whole point I've been trying to make about the tip of the iceberg, because it all comes down to diagnosing it, right? So if you're older and you've got chest pain, the likelihood that that's going to be diagnosed as a myocarditis as opposed to being dismissed as your regular kind of heart attack is smaller. When you're really young, no one's going to think, oh, well, he's just having a heart attack. But the chance of being misdiagnosed gets higher the older you are. And then moreover, when people actually actively sought it, so that there was this very key point where people said, look, let's take a whole group and see what happens when we vaccinate them. So this happened in Thailand. They took teenage boys mostly who were having their second doses, and they did ECGs on them beforehand, and then they gave them the dose and they followed them up and they took down notes of symptoms, more ECGs, and they did that blood test, that troponin test, to see if they'd had heart damage. And when they did that, about 30% of them had symptoms, which is just incredible, like heart symptoms. But 3% of them had a rise in this troponin level, showing that they'd had some heart damage. Now, some people have argued that the rise was trivial, that you can get that kind of rise, from other things. And there might be some truth in that. But the point is that, this was a measurable impact of the vaccine on these teenage boys. Now, then the same methodology was repeated on a study in Switzerland, but they used staff at a university. So they were older, and they were men, and they were women, and they found the same thing. So this whole kind of idea that it was only teenage boys, I think a lot of that's to do with it being picked up. But when you go looking for it, you start to see it in a much broader population, and it was still 3% having this troponin rise.
Well, so those studies, I think, are very important, and if they're inside the case. If you type in Thailand myocarditis adolescent study, you'll find it. I didn't know about this Swiss study, so I will jump onto case and check that out. I'd not heard about that. I'm very interested to hear that was replicated. Both very, very interesting studies, and both really sit as totems in defiance of the broadly accepted picture here, that originally there's no problem at all, then there is a problem, and the problem is very, very small, don't worry about it, and even if you do get the problem, it's mild. This is contested, we argue here, and the data to support that is inside case. Before we move on to the next section, this issue of causation is something that I just want to speak to, because it's not random. How does this happen? Is it, and how do we know? And what do we know, I should say? So
ultimately, we don't know. And the thing with biology is that you can always come up with stories about how things work, but you don't necessarily have, the sort of gold-plated data to back them up. So I can tell you a variety of ways it might happen, and I can give you evidence that supports them all. So with viral myocarditis, one of the main hypotheses about that, how that one occurs, is that the virus has proteins in it which look like proteins in the heart. And so your immune system starts attacking the virus, and when it's doing that, it accidentally attacks a whole load of heart cells as a kind of bystander impact. So it's like your immune system's being redirected. It's a thing called molecular mimicry. And that could well be happening here. So it could just be that your immune response is attacking the heart without the vaccine ever having gone anywhere near the heart, hypothetically. Then if we think about what the vaccine actually does, the whole purpose of the mRNA platform is to make your own cells into spike factories, at which point your immune system comes along, kills those cells because they're now expressing foreign protein, and then learns from that, so that if at a later date a virus in a virally infected cell looks like that, it can kill it. Now, we were told the vaccine stays in the arm, but there's plenty of evidence that that was a myth from the beginning. And what happens when you put a load of fluid into a muscle is it quickly gets taken up by the vascular system into veins. Anything that's not in a vein goes into the lymphatics, and both of them end up very quickly in the heart. So you're almost beelining to the heart. And that's why if you've got a bee sting reaction and someone's got anaphylaxis, you shove adrenaline into their muscle with an injection, because that adrenaline will get everywhere really quick and save their life. So we know intramuscular injections go everywhere, and they went everywhere. And so that means that you can have heart cells expressing spike, and we've seen that at post-injection. And then the immune system comes along and kills those heart cells, because that's what, it's expressing a foreign protein. So the whole platform is designed to potentially kill heart cells, which is just a disastrous situation. And then furthermore, you've got the lipid nanoparticles themselves. So even if you didn't have any mRNA and there was no spike, there's potential to be concerned about those lipid nanoparticles causing cell damage. And I've got a particular concern about that because Moderna have since done a trial on Epstein-Barr virus, which is the one that causes glandular fever and actually a whole variety of other problems, but largely glandular fever. And they had a myocarditis issue in that trial when they were using lipid nanoparticles again, but with a different mRNA. And of course, it could be because of the same thing, that the mRNA is making you kill heart cells. But there's, the platform is my concern here rather than the spike itself.
If it's not already in the case, I believe there is data that supports this idea that the vaccine was not staying at the site of administration in the arm. Basically, it's going elsewhere. Now, I think, again, conceptually, people might not have been too concerned about that because, and this brings us on to our next subject, that product was sold and understood to be a vaccine. And I think that's relatively, sometimes perhaps at a stretch, fair. And again, this is an extremely, for whatever reason, this subject is an extremely sort of like triggering area for people. In actual fact, you could quite easily conceptualize those products as gene therapy. And before you run off thinking I sound like a raving conspiracy theorist, I'm just going to play you this clip that was from the World Health Summit in 2021 in October, where the CEO of, I believe it's Bayer, is describing how Bayer wants to move into this space of cell and gene therapy.
For us, therefore, we're really taking that leap, us as a company, Bayer, in cell and gene therapy, which to me is one of these examples where really we're going to make a difference, hopefully, moving forward. There's some, ultimately, the mRNA vaccines are an example for that cell and gene therapy. I always like to say, if we had surveyed 2 years ago in the public, would you be willing to take gene or cell therapy and inject it into your body, we would have probably had a 95% refusal rate. I think this pandemic has also opened many people's eyes to innovation in the way that was maybe not possible before.
So for me, this is an amazing clip, because if you try to research this, if you type this guy's name into Google and maybe you heard what he said, you're like, wait, that's not true. You will get a whole search page result of fact checks. In fact, we can run that theory right now. So Stefan Ehrlich, let's just put it, Stefan Ehrlich gene therapy. And you get full fact saying that the Bayer executive has wrongly said that the mRNA vaccines are a gene therapy, and a range of other subject matters. And so this leaves the public in a precarious situation, because now you have the CEO of a pharmaceutical company describing in front of all of his colleagues this product as a cell and gene therapy. And then one presumes some PR department of the pharmaceutical industry being concerned that the public hear about their product in this way, and this attempt to downplay those statements and say, no, don't worry, it's not a cell and gene therapy. What data do we have about that? Like, how can we conceptualize these products?
Let's be really, really generous, right? I think at the outset, the public's perception of the word gene therapy was a medicine that would change your DNA. I think that would be a fair summary of what people think that meant. And there were gene therapies which indeed were doing that. That was a thing for people who've got genetic problems. And so I can understand the pharmaceutical industry being very cautious about wanting, avoiding that term, because they didn't set out to change people's DNA. So that's why he was calling it cell therapy, because what he was trying to refer to then is this idea that you're using the genetics of a cell, but you're not in the DNA part of that system. So you've got, I like to explain it as being like a recipe, right? So you've got your DNA recipe in the nucleus, which is like what's on the internet. And then you print off the recipe you're going to use in the kitchen that day, and that's like your RNA. And after you've used it to make whatever you're making, it just gets binned, and you start again, going back to your internet of recipes. And so this, what they were trying to do was just put the pieces of paper in with the idea that they'd get binned after a while. But in reality, using the word vaccine is a different league to saying this isn't a gene therapy because it doesn't interfere with your, we don't intend it to interfere with your DNA. The word vaccine has got a very, very, very special status in the public mind. It is unimpeachable. They are by definition safe and effective. And anyone that criticizes them in any way, well, they're an anti-vaxxer who we can smear and slur and ignore. So you've gone from saying, well, let's not call it something that the public are terrified of, and let's call it something that the public, treat like some kind of holy thing. And so, it couldn't have been more extreme what they did with that. And that what got lost in the middle, because when you jump from, gene cell therapy, well, this is new. And this is stuff that might have impacts that we're not yet aware of. And certainly we would want to be checking very carefully for any unexpected changes to the genes in a cell afterwards, or any kind of cancer impact, because cancer is a genetic disease. So you go from that extreme to, oh, well, it's a vaccine, which means that we don't have to do all of this testing, which is what the regulators did. They put it onto a vaccine channel as if it were an influenza vaccine that get produced every year by the same methodology using eggs. And because they produced every year, they can't go through all of the testing every time. So they tweak it to each sort of annual change in the eggs. And they say, well, we've done all the sort of foundational testing. We'll just do a little bit of testing and get these out. And they put it on that track. So it went from, hang on a minute, really, really, we ought to be very, very cautious, to let's just get these out there as quickly as possible. And the public, obviously, the way it was presented and the kind of propaganda that went around with it, they just took it to be a vaccine, like a vaccine as in you're going to educate my immune system. You're all saying it's perfectly safe. I've believed this all my life, that vaccines are safe. Don't have anything to worry about. And anybody who's talking about these other issues, they must be anti-vaxxers, and so I can ignore them and smear them.
Even in this clip of Stefan Ulrich from Bayer, you can see that the industry is thrilled with this. And I think that's worth bearing in mind, because if you look at, and I believe this is in the case actually, the original Moderna SEC filings, not the latest version, and even some of them on the BioNTech website, which was acquired by Pfizer, they discuss the technology and why you ought to invest, and they have to declare this as part of their investment protocols and whatnot. They had to tell their investors where they were at in this regulatory process. And in those documents, they explicitly said that at that time, before this pandemic kicked off, the FDA considered mRNA to be a gene therapy. And broadly what those documents are doing is they're sharing with their investors to say, these are the steps we're taking to kind of grease the cogs here and get this product moved through, because we recognize, gene therapy scares people, this and that. And like you say, we went from gene therapy, the public, as Stefan says, likely would have run a mile. And we, hop, skip and a jump, we were at vaccine and the public have no idea. The step in the middle, I think, is the fairest one actually, that was skipped over, was cell therapy. And that would have required a broader informed consent process saying, this is actually a cell therapy. It's somewhere between the two. A conversation clearly the pharmaceutical industry wanted to avoid, and they did avoid that conversation. And they very much resent us bringing it up. So let's move on to this idea of the different regulators, because now, even if we stay on the subject matter of gene therapy, cell therapy, we can segue into regulation. There are differences in the way the regulators are now advising people use these products. And very often, for the people most aggrieved by this discussion, the people who are most kind of committed to making sure that any vaccine that's ever put on the market is perfect and wonderful and great, are very keen to say, well, the regulators say X, and so therefore, off you go, you should go and do what the regulators or the health agencies say. But there's actually a fairly broad difference between those positions. If you look at the United States, Europe, and Australia, for example. Maybe we could speak to those differences.
Yeah, I mean, they're getting bigger and bigger, aren't they? So that at the moment in the UK, the COVID vaccines are sort of, we've got a spring booster campaign. Mm-hmm. And what they did for the first time for this spring booster campaign is they tried to work out a cost benefit analysis. So they said, right, if it costs us 25 quid, that's what they reckoned, to vaccinate somebody all in, at what point is that not worth it? So, are you worth 25 quid? Now, when someone's really sick with COVID on intensive care, that's expensive. It's really, really expensive. I mean, even an A&E trip is expensive. So you can quickly, just one person out of many people could end up sick with COVID, and you could quickly justify £25 to give it to an awful lot of people in order to prevent that one thing happening. But when they did the sums, they reckoned they could only justify £25 to over 95-year-olds. And that's based on taking pharma data at face value. So the protocol in the UK at the moment is over 95-year-olds, over 75-year-olds with comorbidities, and anyone who's got immune suppression, and nobody else at all. Whereas in the States, they're still talking about, up until very recently, there were universities still demanding it of their students. So, it couldn't be more extreme, that difference, really.
It's a strange thing, and I think it's this tacit an admission that we will get from the UK regulators that, hey, there's a problem here. And I don't think they'll ever explicitly state that, but as the old saying goes, judge me by my actions, not by my statements, right? Judge me by what I do.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, though, because the regulatory sort of environment is more than just a regulator. The regulator has done nothing at any point to be cautious, nothing at all. But there are other factors at play. So the JCVI vocalized and wrote quite well about the risks, and then just ignored them and recommended it, or got put under political pressure to recommend them anyway. But the protocol at the moment that's a kind of NHS financial decision that was sort of based around. So you've got different factors coming into play, different excuses being lent on, while the regulator still, frankly, is failing. It's
curious also that it's understood in this paradigm of money. I can't think of many science studies that would use cost per patient as an end point. Primarily, it would be, what are the risks to you from the product versus what are the risks to you of not using the product, and what's the differences between the two. But here at that level of our government and healthcare system, they're actually saying, how much is it going to cost us, and where is that benefit coming? And you have to work backwards from that to see, well, what the safety implications and efficacy implications are probably not great if the cost benefit only comes into play for people reaching the age of 95 and onwards, bearing in mind that the average age of death in the United Kingdom is somewhere around 82, 83. So we're talking about people, to be, very blunt about it, at the end of their life. It almost implies there's basically no benefit whatsoever, but the public, someone would have to come and do the work to demonstrate that to the public. Otherwise, they don't really hear or understand why £25 to save a 95-year-old is a good idea,
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think seeing it in financial terms does kind of give you a little window into the fact there is no efficacy. But that as you said, that's not what people like. If you are deciding, should I get this jab, and someone says, well, I can't be bothered spending 25 quid on you, so we're not going to give it to you. You're like, well, that's interesting, but actually that wasn't my concern. Maybe I should go and spend 25 quid on myself, right? So your concern is not your money, and you can now get them privately in London for £45 to just walk in and get them. And so, what's of concern to you is, what are the benefits to me, which don't really exist, I'm afraid. And then what are the harms to me? And the trouble with that question is that is something that we're still measuring. And we can't tell you about harms that haven't yet been measured.
That part that you've mentioned of, we won't spend £25 on you and we're not going to explain exactly why, leaves a lot of people in the public, and I follow a lot of these people on Twitter because I like to get these perspectives, who feel abandoned. And it's very difficult to talk to those people to say, in a sense, I understand that perspective, because they have been abandoned in a sense, because they feel like, well, we have to go and work this out for ourselves now. I feel like this, you told me this pandemic, this COVID thing is terrible and dreadful and awful, and now you're saying that you won't pay for my vaccine. So they get thrown into the mire to say, you go and work out what the risks are, you go and work out what the cost benefits are, you go and work out what the risks of the products we're advertising are, and you come to your own decision. Now, if you tried to do that as a citizen in 2024, I think you will really struggle, because again and again and again, you'll go on you type in whatever you like into Google, where there is an incentive, you will find an outcome. And the front page of Google overwhelmingly now is corporatized, politicized, and it leaves the public completely in a hopeless position, where they're being told, work it out for yourself, but there's no way they're going to be able to work it out for themselves. They are at the whims of these huge companies. So let's quickly jot on to some of these mistakes that perhaps have been made, where in Australia, on that side, there is somewhat of a reckoning starting to emerge. And there's a senator there called Rennick, and he's been holding their regulators to account over this issue of, well, once he's learned, in actual fact, it perhaps wasn't a traditional vaccine as he might have understood, and he's learned that it's something different. Let's just take a look.
I have a Pfizer document here from their own website. It says,
seek to table that or circulate it, so
yep, happy to do that.
Know what we're talking about.
Gene therapies are a delicate and intentional process encapsulating the desired gene. Manufacturing gene therapies is challenging, and it requires certain steps, including transfection. That is on Pfizer's own website. I'm happy to table that. Actually, I've just got to read one other thing, sorry. And then I have also from the website of the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy, because the vaccine, it's referring to the COVID mRNA vaccine, introduces new genetic material into cells for a short period of time to induce antibodies. It is a gene therapy as defined by the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy. And then the TGA's own Pfizer non-clinical report, page 19, says the proposed commercial-scale manufacturing process includes use of linearised plasmid DNA template for mRNA production. So we've now got Pfizer themselves who admit that the mRNA vaccines were gene therapy. The American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy admits the mRNA vaccines are gene therapy. And we've got the TGA themselves admit the DNA was used in the manufacturing process. Why wasn't the actual mRNA vaccine tested for genotoxicity, and why didn't the Office of Genetic OTG Therapeutics look at it in terms of a gene technology?
Okay. Dr. Raj Bhula, Gene Technology Regulator. Thank you for your question, Senator. I think the first part about the genotoxicity, that question has been asked before, because the Therapeutic Goods Administration was the approving authority for the vaccine products. That is a question for TGA on genotoxicity. In relation to your question around manufacturing, I think it's useful to put a bit of context around that, in that the committee is aware the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines were fully formulated and imported into Australia, which meant that there was actually no manufacture of the mRNA or the vaccine product itself here in Australia. If indeed the mRNA was being manufactured here, and it's correct that gene technology was used in the modification of the mRNA, then under the Gene Technology Act, an approval would have been required for that manufacturing step.
Oh, well, that contradicts what you've said previously. You've said previously no. Gene therapy and gene technology wasn't used. Now you're saying because it was produced in another country that you're not responsible for checking the gene therapy
side. So the Gene Technology Act doesn't reach into manufacturing in other countries.
I'm going to pause it there because they get stuck in the weeds there. But I find this an amazing clip in which, and I know there's a lot of moving around, if I could try and surmise that, the body that's given the responsibility to regulate gene Technologies in Australia makes the argument to this senator that because the mRNA vaccines were not manufactured in Australia, it's not their responsibility to look. And had they been manufactured in Australia, they essentially would have been considered a gene therapy. But because they were manufactured elsewhere, it gets imported wholesale. It's not their responsibility whatsoever. So she essentially washes her hands of it. But interestingly, does admit that had it been an Australian company and manufactured in Australia, it would have come under those regulations.
Yeah, one thing that, I mean, I don't think there's any excuse for what they did, but one thing that I do find interesting is that if you can get yourself into the frame of mind of being terrified and thinking we've got to get these vaccines out, it's the only thing to save us, that frame of mind, then even then you'd say, right, we get them out, but we carry on demanding all the tests are done afterwards, right?
Right.
Because you need to know. And they didn't. Nobody did. None of these regulators have demanded these tests, and they still haven't been done. It's ridiculous. And
of course, there's this huge issue of in the Pfizer trial that we had this data up until somewhere around 2020, when they were originally trialing the data for the Pfizer's mRNA vaccine. And as soon as they collected that initial body of data, they published and famously went to the New England Journal of Medicine, and they said, there was this famous graph that showed the rates of positive PCR tests. The adverse events between those two groups are comparable, and isn't it great? We're onto the market. And right after that fact, they vaccinated the control group. So the long-term, it's not, from that point on, you don't easily have a group A, group B data set where you can continue to do these studies that you're mentioning. Our opportunity to do that was gone.
Yeah, I mean, that was outrageous. And when that actually happened, the argument being made was the placebo group in this trial will want to go and get vaccines, and they will drop out of the trial in order to do that. And so we need to offer it to them within the trial so that we can keep following them up. That was the argument they made. But they had vaccinated all of these participants who were mostly fairly young at a time when the only other people that had been jabbed had been the very old. It was completely out of proportion of what was going on in the public. And the thing is, it's a playbook. It's not like that was the only time that's ever happened. That happens every single time. It happened in the children's trials, and there's there should never have been children's trials. Like, that was unethical from the off. But the idea that we've got to vaccinate these children because it's unethical not to, and it's absolutely ridiculous. But it's what they do again and again and again with these studies.
Who will they type in on your case to find that? I know that is it Jack and Napes? Is that his name? He writes about that on Substack. Do you guys write about that on Heart? Is that something they'll find in your case?
Yeah, no, I would definitely go to Research Rebel for that. He's done lots of work on that. And we have touched on it a little bit on Heart, but he's got the details there.
One of the challenging areas is this idea of a patent that was held. Perhaps you can explain this much better than I can.
So when you go back to the Pfizer trial, that's what we've got the most documentation on, because it's been released through a court case in Texas, which I'm very grateful for. So we know more about that than the others. But if we just look at the detail at that one, what happened was they were doing everything in parallel. That was what they were sort of made an excuse to do. But they were doing the basic workup of a molecule called B1. So it's called BNT162B1, which means BioNTech experiment on number 162, molecule B1. And this B1 molecule was the receptor binding domain of the spike protein. So it's about 6 of the size of the whole spike. And there was good evidence that if you just use that little bit of the spike protein, then you would have a lower risk of antigen-dependent enhancement, which was this worry that the immune system would actually overreact, and then when you saw the virus, you'd end up sicker than you would have been otherwise. So that's what they did all of this work up on, like loads and loads of experimental work. And then something really strange happened, whereby on the 15th of June 2020, the first person gets vaccinated with a molecule called B2, which is the whole spike molecule, with 2 of the amino acid building blocks switched out to try to hold it into a position where it couldn't get into a cell. And that molecule they wrote up and published on, saying that it was safe and that they could use it. But if you look through the data, they hadn't given it to as many people as they were claiming, and they hadn't got the follow-up that they were claiming in order to be able to do that. And then they very shortly afterwards announced, right, this is the one we're going to use. And you're like, well, where did all this come from? You know, it was a really strange sequence of events that does not add up in terms of any kind of logic. And then it transpires that the two proline amino acids that were switched out to hold it in position were part of a patent that's owned by NIAID, which is Fauci's department. And that patent was to say, well, you know, if you do that little tweak, it means it reduces the risk of antigen-dependent enhancement. And that patent was also used by Moderna, and it means that there are kickbacks to his department, and they're not small kickbacks. So there were $400 million given in the first tranche of payouts from it. So you've got these royalties that are coming from the people who are deciding who gets what, and who seem to have also dictated to the pharma companies what molecule they could use.
It's a remarkable thing. This government organization held a patent on some proteins that ended up being used inside the mRNA platform, which caused a financial incentive to use those products over other ones. And at the end, the number is a very, very large number of money. It's something like $400 million, right? Was received as a kickback to a government agency.
Yeah, and this isn't just to the department, to be clear. There are individuals within that who have royalties.
The incentives are not always aligned in the way that you would like, because as you said, there was perhaps a better protein that they might have used and had been using.
One thing they did manage to do was claim that the side effects were much worse when they just used a sixth of the mRNA from the spike, just the little one. But of course, what they did when they were presenting that data is they were saying, well, if we use, you know, however many micrograms of RNA that's coding for this compared to the same number of micrograms coding for something 6 times as big, then you get more side effects. But you're like, well, hang on, that means you've produced like 6 times as many molecules, because, you know, you've got 6 times as many. It's just because it's a smaller amount. So you're not really comparing like with like anymore. I
know this is a crude analogy, but it rings true sometimes about this whole Grenfell disaster, where there's kind of like, why ever use a substandard product? People looked at that disaster and thought, you know, how did this product to clad this building ever become used anywhere? It's ultimately not good. But there was a financial incentive for these companies to use that product over other ones, because when we sell it, we're going to make more money. And the idea that some similar mechanism of incentives is happening inside the medicine and mRNA platforms and things as complicated as gene manufacturing processes, as mRNA, as cell therapy, that these companies research one protein, say, hey, well, this is looking pretty good, and these are all the reasons we should probably use this one. And there's a massive financial incentive to use a different protein simply because someone has a patent on it is not at all what I think and how I believe the public conceptualize this research.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely not. You know, you kind of assume that, wrongly, that scientists and people in positions of power, when they're talking about something like public health, genuinely don't want to cause harm and want to make sure that what they're doing is what's in the best interest of the population. Because not doing that is, you know, frankly evil. And yet, you know, we managed to get hold of evidence like this that they were not thinking in that way. They weren't thinking about being careful and making sure they were making the right decisions. They were making decisions that were in their own self-interest.
Yes. And again, it's something I've written about on the Digger and intend to write about a lot more. Just yesterday, I've got this prototype together, which I shared with you actually. Very early stages right now, and all I did was run a couple of scientific papers through this piece of code, effectively, that I've written. And at the end of that process, you end up with a network map of the people who contributed to that paper and the money they've received from the industry. And the more and more data that goes into this system that I've started to write, the bigger that network map becomes. And within 3 scientific papers, actually just chosen at random, one of these scientific papers was looking at a drug called molnupiravir. I'd seen this study before many times, but the penny had never dropped until I ran it through this system I built, that Jonathan Van Tam was a co-author on this study. And I was like, oh, he's the deputy chief medical officer, or he was at the time. And right there in black and white, even though you haven't clearly noticed it, it tells you that he's in receipt of lecture fees from Gilead, who own this particular drug. And he's sitting on the advisory board of La Roche, another pharmaceutical company. And at that time, he's advising the UK government on medical policy. And it just flies in the face of this idea of the noble discipline of medicine, in which let's do what's right for the patient, the public. Of course, I believe that these people also want to do what's right and want to do the right thing, but we cannot ignore the fact that these huge financial incentives are there.
Yeah, totally. And of course, the thing is about conflicts of interest is that the reason that you meant to excuse yourself from decision making is because it's subconscious, right? It's not necessarily that you're out for your own. But we know humans will subconsciously make bad decisions when they've got conflicts of interest. And there does seem to be this crazy idea that there aren't any doctors out there who are not associated with all of these conflicts. And that's just simply not true. It's absolutely not true. It's just that the ones who are in power are all connected to each other and they all seem to have the same interest. That's the problem.
Yeah. And I think that, until perhaps if I can get this thing finished, and I may well bake it into case.science if I get the funding and that I need to do that, instead of being able to only search for information via the topic, you'll actually be able to search for information via the funders as well. So you could say, okay, show me all the papers about ivermectin, molnupiravir, remdesivir, whatever, and exclude all of the ones where any of the authors who were on the paper were associated with the industry. And I think once you have that filter, you'll probably see that there are almost no papers left. All of the papers on this subject. And I think that's particularly, the mRNAs will be interesting because I believe there's probably quite a lot of independent researchers that have done interesting work on that because they were so broadly available. But products like these novel pharmaceutical products, they're often like $1,000, $2,000 a dose. It's not easy for some independent scientist with a nose for nonsense who thinks, I'm going to go and run a study with an N size of 2,000 and pay all this money. How are they going to do that?
In reality, we kind of created this situation whereby regulators who were aware that, pharmaceutical companies need strict rules and boundaries about how they do clinical trials because they've got conflicts of interest. And so regulatory systems have put in place all sorts of obstacles to doing a clinical trial, which basically makes them prohibitively expensive, such that only pharma can do them. No, that's completely the wrong way around. We need to just say, look, I'm sorry, pharmaceutical companies, you cannot be in charge of your own clinical trials. These are human experiments. We can't have people with conflict of interest in charge of them. There has to be a separation. You have to say, look, sure, you can fund stuff, but it has to go through a centralized system, and any experiments done on humans have to be done by independent people who are in charge of the data, in charge of the results, because otherwise it's immoral and we can't keep doing it.
Claire, is there any area we haven't covered that you think is particularly relevant to your case? We actually ventured away a little bit, but
really
I think it was,
didn't we?
We did.
So coming back to the case, so when I sort of introduced the case, I was saying about how I have this question, and to me it is a question, and I have built it up as a case, and I think it's a strong case. But there are still questions about why people are having too many heart attacks, and so there are aspects of the evidence where it's grey. And I think, for instance, young people in the UK were dying too much in autumn of 2020 before the vaccines rolled out. They were already dying too much. So I think there was absolutely impact of lockdowns, and we know psychological stress causes heart disease, so there's definitely more than one factor feeding into it. But I think one thing that's really important that people have been, told lies around is the impact of COVID on heart disease. So that's sort of the go-to excuse, isn't it? Let's blame the virus. But what we can do quite simply to show that that wasn't the issue is go and look at countries that hadn't really had much COVID. So they had the vaccines. What happened in countries like Australia and Singapore that had the vaccines, then had a COVID, their first major COVID wave happened, December 21, January 2022 with Omicron. So prior to that, people hadn't had COVID. What was happening to their death? What was happening to their number of people with heart attacks? And it went up with the vaccine rollout. I think once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. That is the control group. It was the vaccines.
What sources are those? Because we didn't actually get into these, because there's data that's collected at the clinical trial level, but then there are things like, and you could speak to this, places like the Office of National Statistics in the UK and other agencies that are collecting this data. Are they the places where you and others, I should say, are making these determinations of a rise in cardiovascular problems after vaccine rollout?
Yeah. So what's challenging about this is that you'll find if you're making that case, if I was to write a paper and try to get that through the peer review system, won't go anywhere. So we know I've been publishing that kind of work in Heart. So the thing I've uploaded into Case is from Heart, but within that Heart article, there are all the source documentation. So these are generally analyses of real world data published by health, authorities in Australia or Singapore, wherever else. So all of the raw data is there. I've shown the analysis that we've done on it, and go and look at the raw data. It's a one step away in that link because we've referenced it in those articles.
So that to get that data, go into the Case and type in, what do you think they would type in?
What Australia and Singapore would do.
Okay, well, Claire, this has been brilliant. We aimed for an hour. We've done an hour and 10 minutes. There are so many other things I think it would be good to talk about, actually. Loads. But I'm very pleased with how this has gone. For the audience listening, I would like you to know that we really didn't even get into the nuts and bolts of this at all. I hope this was useful and interesting. If you're still skeptical, I understand. Hopefully we've given you some fat to chew on. If you liked the sound of this and this podcast, please do share it. It really does help. The audience we get is the audience that you guys create. If you think it's useful to someone, send them a message, send them a link. You can check out Claire's work where, Claire?
So heartgroup.org is where I do most of my writing. And I'm also on Twitter at Clare Craig Path.
Great. And there's another book that Claire's working on. Have I said too much? I don't know, but there is another book on the way, and her book is available on Amazon. You can follow me on Twitter at Philly Harper, and my Substack is philharper.substack.com. And for all of the sources, hopefully all, that we've done referenced today in this podcast, you'll find them at case.science/case/16. But if you just go to the case.science page, you should find it there. And any questions or thoughts or queries you have about any of the data, you can ask a natural language question in that case. And hopefully the AI will go through all of that data, find the most relevant segments of the data that we discussed today, and present it back to you and answer your questions. Claire, thanks very much. Is there any final closing thoughts?
Well, actually, I was thinking we should just show them. We should go into Case and just type Australia, ask a question about Australia and show them how it works.
Okay, I'm going to do exactly that. So this is Claire's case. COVID vaccines caused an increase in heart disease is the title. On the left, you can see all of the sources that are associated with this case. You can click through them and browse through them. If any of them look interesting to you, just click on the source and it will immediately ask the AI a question about that source and the AI will answer. But Claire wanted to ask about Australia, so let's go ahead and do that. What happened in Australia after the COVID-19 vaccine rollout? You can see it starts thinking, it's looking through the database, And there you can go and see its answer straight away. Australia saw a significant increase in deaths above expected levels starting from June 2021, despite having minimal COVID cases before that time. I draw your attention to this part at the bottom. It's sourcing that information. And if you wanted, you could click directly on these links and it would take you straight through to the original source. Or if you wanted to continue the conversation but only focus on these particular sources, you could say, please tell me more. And it's only going to use about the vaccines in this example. It's only going to use that one source to find its answer. So if we press enter now, you can see it's thinking, and it's using that one particular source, and it gives you some more information about it. And as you can see in the sources used, it's now only using that one source. If we want to go back to the whole case and ask another case, please tell me about how COVID vaccines cause heart disease. Now something interesting is going to happen now. You can see that because we're not logged in, it's asking us to register to carry on the conversation. You can carry on with your conversations for free after you've registered and logged in. So don't worry about that, but this is just because we're not logged in right now, it's prompting us to register. For free users, you'll be on GPT-3, but for paid users, you'll get much more coherent answers by being upgraded to GPT-4. So that is case.science. Go ahead, give it a go and share it if you find it interesting. Okay, I think that went really well. So I'm going to stop the recording now.